Let's start with Russia. We've seen the headlines come out day after day after day. What do you make of where things stand in terms of the broader relationship that the U.S. has with Russia right now?
Well, first, it's very good to be with you. I think our relationship with Russia is going to be a largely adversarial one as far out as I can see, over the next few years. There's some just fundamental differences between us. We obviously have to work at it because, Russia's too big and important to ignore. But, I think we have to be realistic about it as well.
What did you make of the meeting that took place a couple of days ago in Hamburg? President Trump sitting down with President Putin. Their foreign policy advisors were there with them, and just one other person, a translator for each. A small forum. What do you make of how long it lasted and what was said to have come out of it?
Well, meetings with Putin tend to last for a long time. I think the atmosphere was probably a lot chummier than it should have been, given the depth of the problems between us. But again, I think you just have to be realistic. I think on a lot of the big issues between us, Ukraine, for example, it's shaped far more by differences than by any potential common ground. So, it's a smart thing to engage with the Russian leadership, but you got to do it with your eyes wide open and with realistic expectations.
Let me ask you more about that. You served as U.S. ambassador to Russia, have experience interacting with the Russian government. What's the flavor of diplomacy with them? How different is it from diplomacy with other countries around the world? Well,
the best of Russian diplomats, like Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, are first-rate, in terms of their diplomatic skills, but they're extremely tough, and they've played a relatively weak hand, I think, pretty well, just as, looking at it purely from a diplomatic perspective. But they're going to be stubborn, they're very difficult to move, and you've got to be very firm in dealing with them on issues and not convey a sense that you're not going to push hard with regard to American interests.
I wonder what your reaction was to the G20 meeting that we saw. The U.S. stood on the sidelines as a communique about climate change was signed by the other 19 members of that alliance. How problematic is this retreat from multilateralism, do you think?
I think it's really problematic in the sense that we live at a moment of huge changes on the international landscape. That's precisely the moment where the United States should want to be engaged. And our leadership may not be exactly the same as it was when we were a more dominant power, but we're certainly the preeminent power in the world today. And you look around that G20 table, we have the strongest hand to play. Whether you look at the strength of our military or our economy, its innovativeness. But, we're dealing ourselves out of the game right now with the strongest hand at the table. And I think that's a real cause for concern over time, whether it's on the Paris Climate Agreement, on the future of open trading relationships around the world, or a lot of other issues, too. It comes at our expense.
The agenda at that meeting shifted after test of that missile on July the 4th by North Korea. For you, how momentous was that? How big a change did that represent, the testing of that new type of weapon?
Well, I think it's yet another significant step in the steady progress that the North Korean regime is making toward having the capacity to deliver a missile with a nuclear warhead on it against the continental United States. And, the best estimates I've seen are that somewhere within the next 2 or 3 years, they're going to have that capacity. North Korea is the land of unappealing policy options. Force has its limitations. In the sense that you've got 20 million residents of the greater Seoul area who are exposed to North Korean threat, along with lots of other people in the region. But at the same time, the notion of accepting and then deterring North Korean nuclear and missile program has very little appeal, too. So the challenges for diplomacy, the question is, how do you build up leverage behind that diplomacy to give you some chance of preventing the North Koreans from getting to that point and ultimately trying to denuclearize the North Korean peninsula, although that's going to be an extraordinarily difficult goal to achieve.
We saw shortly thereafter a meeting of the UN Security Council, an emergency meeting. Are there more diplomatic options left? You look at the sanctions that have been implemented, the degree to which they've been enforced by the U.S. and other countries, including China. Are there more options still when it comes to diplomacy?
It's tough. They're relatively limited. The key is China. North Korea, 85% of its trade is with China. And I think the reality is, if we're honest about this, is that for China right now, they see greater strategic risk in putting so much pressure on the North Korean regime that you risk a political implosion in North Korea, greater risk than the continued progress of the North Koreans in their nuclear and missile programs. So the diplomatic challenge is not just with regard to North Korea, it's also with regard to China. How do you change that calculus? Certainly the kind of things that are being discussed now, those that we employed against Iran a few years ago, secondary sanctions that would affect Chinese banks, will get the attention of the Chinese leadership. So do steps to strengthen missile defense defense cooperation with South Korea and with Japan, which the Chinese see as encroaching in security terms on their interests in Northeast Asia. So those are the kind of steps that might get their attention over time. But without that kind of leverage, I think there's very little chance that you're going to be able to move to first freeze and roll back and then, ultimately try and denuclearize.
I think the time takes on a different meaning when it comes to diplomacy, and we have a president who seems very eager to have things move quickly or happen quickly. I look at the relationship with China under President Trump. I think by the time the president sent out a tweet declaring his frustration with China, he'd had an ambassador in place for 6 days, and maybe 3 months had elapsed since he met with the Chinese president in Florida. What would you say to him? What would you say to the administration about the time horizon you need to have in place to deal with a country like China?
Well, I mean, with regard to China and the North Korea problem, I mean, you have to have a sense of urgency, just given the pace at which the North Korean leadership is moving. But the Chinese leadership and their predecessors going back millennia tend to take the very long view of change. And so you've got to be mindful of that, but you also have to be willing to press sometimes, too, because that's going to be the only way to change their calculus.
Taking a trip around the world here, let me move to the Middle East, and we certainly watched as the president visited Saudi Arabia and Israel, and have seen the tensions that have erupted around Qatar. How momentous a change is that? How difficult is it going to be? How intractable is it going to be to reverse what we've seen there?
I think eventually it'll probably settle, but I think in the near term you're likely to see a stalemate for a while. Secretary Tillerson is in the Gulf right now, which is a good step. But he's handicapped a little bit by mixed signals from the White House and from the president himself, which, have tended to be read by the Saudis, I think, as sort of fully in their camp. And now he's accused by the Saudis and their partners of being pro-Qatari. So it's a real challenge. Of course, the Qataris have to do more things to, restrict the flow of financing or curb the flow of financing to terrorist groups and extremists. But, there aren't any angels in the Gulf either. And so the challenge for American diplomacy is how do you get all these guys who are traditional partners to work more closely together. And that's a classic challenge for American mediation.
What do you say to young people, recent graduates of college or graduate school, who may have considered or wanted to get into the Foreign Service and now are wondering what kind of future there is there, as they say, jobs not filled, nominations not made? What's your message to them about the field of diplomacy right now?
Well, I mean, first you got to be honest about the current landscape. You have a situation now where 40% of our embassies don't have ambassadors. Of the 50-some positions in the State Department that require Senate confirmation, I think only 3 or 4 are filled right now. So there's a real risk in the short term of hollowing out institutions like the State Department. Having said that, we talked about the long view before, and I think it's important to take the long view. American diplomacy is going to be not only important for a long time to come, but if you're young and motivated and you want to make a difference in the world, public service and diplomacy in particular offers huge opportunities. I was an American diplomat for almost 3.5 decades, and I wouldn't have traded it for the world. You have your ups and downs, your frustrations, policies that are hard for you to defend, but there's nothing like that sense of making a difference on that wider scale in promoting the interests of your country.